Before there were thrones, there were fires. And around every fire, someone always decided who sat closest to it. Not because a law existed, not because anyone had been crowned. There was no parchment, no oath, no name for what was happening. And yet, if you had stood at the edge of a hunter-gatherer camp 50,000 years ago and watched long enough, you would have seen it instantly. An order, a shape. Some people spoke first. Some people ate before others touched the meat. Some voices carried more weight in an argument than the loudness of the words should have allowed. We tend to imagine early humans as radically equal, small bands with no leaders, no ranks, no politics. It's a comforting picture. It's also incomplete. What existed instead was something harder to see because it left no monuments. A structure built entirely out of behavior. Glances held a second too long. Decisions deferred to certain people without discussion. Disputes that ended the moment one particular person spoke. No title, no ceremony, just outcome. This is the part of the story that history books tend to skip, mostly because it left nothing to excavate. You cannot dig up a reputation. You cannot carbon date an unspoken agreement about who eats first. So the story of power, as it's usually told, begins thousands of years later, with the first king, the first written law, the first empire. As if power waited politely for civilization to arrive before it started organizing people. It didn't wait. It was already running the room. What we're really looking at, in that fire circle, is the earliest version of something we still live inside of today. An invisible seating chart. Who gets heard first in a meeting? Whose disagreement is taken seriously and whose is smiled through? Who occupies the head of the table, even at a table with no assigned seats? The fire is gone. The circle isn't. To understand power, we have to stop starting the story where it becomes visible, with crowns and constitutions, and start where it actually began, in the space before anyone thought to give it a name. Ask most people when power began, and they'll reach for a name. A pharaoh, a Mesopotamian king, someone with a title carved into stone, a lineage recorded, a throne that survived long enough to be excavated. It feels like the natural starting point. Power begins where the evidence begins. But that's a trick of the record, not a fact of history. By the time the first king sat on the first throne, the behaviors that made kingship possible were already unfathomably old. Status hierarchies, coalition building, the instinct to defer to certain individuals under certain conditions. These weren't invented for the monarchy. The monarchy was built on top of them, the way a house is built on ground that was already there. Writing gave us the illusion that history starts where the ink starts. It doesn't. It's simply where our ability to see clearly begins. Everything before that point wasn't an absence of power. It was power operating in a form that doesn't fossilize. You can find a burial mound. You can't find the moment someone talked their way out of a fight using nothing but reputation. So here is the uncomfortable correction. The first king wasn't an invention. He was a formalization. Somebody, somewhere, took a set of behaviors that already worked in small groups, the deference, the fear, the sense of who gets the final word, and gave it permanence. A name, a bloodline, a story that outlived the man wearing it. Which raises the real question this documentary is actually about. Not, who was the first king? Because that's a trivia answer, ultimately unknowable and beside the point. The real question is harder and far more interesting. If crowns didn't create power, what did? To answer that, we have to leave the palace entirely. We have to go back to groups too small to need a throne and watch what filled that space instead. Strip away the crown, the treasury, the land deed, and something strange happens. Power doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. For most of human existence, there was almost nothing to own. No permanent settlements, no stockpiles of grain, no fenced land, no inherited estates, no gold to bury with the dead. Small bands moved with the seasons, carrying only what could be carried. By any modern definition of wealth, everyone was equally poor, and yet groups still organized around certain people. Certain individuals still had more say in where to move, when to hunt, how to settle a dispute. If power required property, none of this should have been possible. But it was because power, it turns out, was never really about what you owned. It was about what you controlled without owning anything at all. A skilled hunter held influence, not because he possessed more meat, but because the group depended on his judgment about where the herd would be. A skilled mediator held influence, not because he owned the outcome of an argument, but because both sides trusted his read of it. Influence flowed toward competence, reliability, and the perception of both, currencies that require no vault, no lock, no inheritance. This is easy to underestimate today because we've spent thousands of years building systems where power and property arrive together, where the throne came with land and the office came with a salary. It's tempting to assume they were always fused. They weren't. Property came later, as a way of making power more durable, more transferable, more inheritable. But the earliest form of power ran on something property can't buy outright, whether people believed you deserved to be listened to, which leads somewhere less comfortable than it first sounds. If influence didn't come from possessions, it came from something far more personal and far harder to secure. It came from what other people thought of you. And that, long before money, long before law, was the first real currency humans ever traded in. Long before coins, before grain stores counted as savings, before anything resembling a marketplace existed, humans were already trading in a currency that never touched their hands. Reputation. It sounds abstract until you consider what it actually bought. Being known as reliable meant being included in a hunt with better odds of success. Being known as trustworthy meant access to alliances that could mean survival during a bad season. Being known as dangerous to cross meant fewer people tested that boundary in the first place. None of this was written down. None of it needed to be. Everyone in a small enough group already carried the ledger in their memory. This is worth sitting with because it inverts something we assume about wealth. We tend to think material resources came first and social standing followed, that you gained respect because you had something to offer. In early human groups, it often ran the other way. Standing came first, and resources followed the standing. People shared more generously with those they respected. They protected those they trusted. They deferred, quietly, to those whose judgment had proven reliable before. Reputation wasn't a reflection of power. It was the mechanism of it. But there's a catch built into a currency like this, and it's one that would end up shaping the rest of human history. Reputation is not a resource that can be locked away. It cannot be inherited outright, hidden in a vault, or handed to a child without effort. It has to be constantly earned, constantly demonstrated, constantly defended in the eyes of others. One bad decision, one broken promise, one lost fight, and the balance could shift overnight. Compare that to a coin. A coin doesn't care what people think of you. Once it's yours, it stays yours regardless of opinion. Reputation offered no such guarantee. It was powerful, but it was fragile, contested every single day by the same group of people who had granted it in the first place. And fragile power, sustained only by the constant approval of others, tends to search for something sturdier to stand on. That search would take tens of thousands of years to fully resolve. But its earliest experiments weren't written in law. They were whispered. It doesn't sound like the start of a legal system. It sounds like the opposite. Idle, petty, beneath serious analysis. But gossip may be one of the oldest instruments of social control humans ever developed. And it worked with a precision that most formal courts would envy. Consider what it actually does. Someone breaks an unspoken rule, hoards food, breaks a promise, mistreats someone weaker. There's no police force to intervene, no judge to rule on it. But within hours, everyone in the group knows what happened. Cooperation quietly narrows around that person. Invitations stop arriving. Trust, once extended by default, has to be re-earned one interaction at a time. No violence was necessary. No formal punishment was declared. The consequence simply arrived on its own, distributed across dozens of small decisions made by other people. This is enforcement without institution, a form of governance that required no building, no title, no written code, and yet reliably shaped behavior across the entire group. Reputation, from the last chapter, was the currency. Gossip was the mechanism that priced it in real time. What makes this worth pausing on is how closely it mirrors what law would later attempt to formalize. A legal system does three things at its core. It defines unacceptable behavior, it detects violations, and it imposes consequences. Informal social policing was already doing all three, just without the paperwork. The taboo functioned as the law. The whispered word functioned as the trial. Exclusion functioned as the sentence. The difference is that gossip scales terribly. It depends on everyone knowing everyone, on a group small enough that reputation can travel faster than a lie can outrun it. The moment a society grows past that threshold, past the size where every member can track every other member's history, this system starts to strain. People become strangers to each other. Reputation stops circulating fast enough to matter. And a group that once policed itself through nothing but conversation suddenly needs something with more permanence. Something that doesn't rely on everyone remembering. That gap, the moment memory could no longer hold a society together, is where formal law would eventually be born. But governance wasn't the first thing to hit that ceiling. Something even older hit it first. The question of who gets to decide what's dangerous and who gets believed when they answer. Every group of early humans lived inside a fog of things that could kill them. Predators in the dark, disease with no visible cause, storms, famine, strangers from outside the group whose intentions were unknown. Danger was constant and mostly incomprehensible. And in that fog, a very specific kind of power began to take shape. Not the power of the strongest, but the power of whoever could explain the threat. This is easy to overlook because it doesn't look like dominance in the usual sense. Nobody forced anyone to listen to the person who claimed to understand why the herd disappeared, or why the sickness came, or which direction was safe to travel. And yet people did listen, because uncertainty is exhausting, and a plausible explanation, offered with confidence, relieves that exhaustion instantly. The person who could name the danger, even wrongly, became someone the group oriented around. There's a pattern hiding inside this that shows up again and again across human history, far beyond the earliest campfires. Authority doesn't only come from strength. It comes from the management of fear, real or invented. Whoever can convincingly say, "I know what this is and I know what to do about it," gains a kind of influence that has nothing to do with physical dominance. It's the influence of the interpreter. An interpretation, unlike hunting skill or physical strength, doesn't require truth to be effective. It only requires belief. This is where power starts to separate from competence for the first time, where being right and being believed become two very different sources of the same authority. A skilled hunter's influence could be tested against results. A skilled interpreter of the unknown often couldn't be tested at all, because the threats being explained, spirits, omens, the will of something unseen, existed exactly where evidence couldn't reach. That gap is not a flaw in the system. It's the space where the earliest form of religious and ritual authority would eventually take root. Because once a group needs someone to explain what cannot be seen, that explanation has to travel somehow, has to be repeatable, teachable, passed to the next person who wasn't there when the danger first appeared. It has to become a story. There's a hard limit to how large a group can grow while still being held together by personal relationships alone. Somewhere around 150 people, give or take, human memory starts to strain. Beyond that number, you can't personally know, trust, or track everyone well enough for reputation and gossip to keep the group coordinated. And yet at some point, human groups grew past that number anyway, into the thousands, eventually into the millions. That should have been impossible using the tools described so far. It wasn't impossible. It just required a new kind of glue. Shared story did what personal memory no longer could. A myth, a ritual, a belief held in common didn't require you to personally know or trust the stranger standing next to you. It only required that you both believe the same thing. Two people who had never met, who shared no history, no reputation between them, could still act as allies, could still cooperate, sacrifice, and organize together, as long as they were bound by the same origin story, the same sacred rule, the same shared account of how the world worked and who mattered within it. This is easy to underestimate because we tend to think of myth and ritual as decoration, culture, not infrastructure. But shared belief was infrastructure in the truest sense. It was the mechanism that let coordination scale past the size any single human mind could track. 150 people can be held together by memory. 150,000 people can only be held together by a story everyone agrees to believe at the same time. And once that mechanism existed, something changed permanently in how power could operate. Influence no longer had to be earned face to face, hunt by hunt, dispute by dispute. It could be inherited through a role, priest, elder, keeper of the story, because the authority didn't rest on personal reputation anymore. It rested on the story itself, and whoever stood closest to it. This is the moment power stopped being something you had to personally demonstrate every day and started being something you could hold simply by occupying the right position inside a shared belief. It's a small shift on the surface. Underneath, it's the hinge the rest of this documentary turns on. Because a system built on personal trust has a ceiling. A system built on shared belief doesn't. Every mechanism this documentary has traced so far, reputation, gossip, fear, shared story, worked because it solved a real problem of coordination. And every one of them, eventually, ran into the same wall: success. A band of 40 people can run entirely on memory. Everyone knows everyone's history. A village of a few hundred can still lean on reputation. Though it starts to strain, you no longer know every stranger's track record firsthand, only what you've heard. But once groups grew into the thousands, the tens of thousands, the systems that once held power together stopped being able to keep up with the size of what they were holding. Shared belief bought time. Myth and ritual let people cooperate without needing to know each other. But belief alone doesn't resolve a dispute between two strangers over land, or punish a theft nobody witnessed, or decide who owes what to whom in a trade neither party will remember exchanging a year later. As populations grew, as strangers multiplied faster than reputations could travel, informal power began to buckle under its own success. The very growth these mechanisms enabled became the thing they could no longer manage. This is worth sitting with, because it inverts the story we usually tell about civilization. The common version goes, humans were disorganized, then civilization arrived and organized them. But that gets the sequence backward. Organization already existed, informal, effective, deeply human. What civilization actually responded to wasn't chaos. It was success outgrowing its own infrastructure. Power didn't need to be invented. It needed to be scaled. And scaling something built on memory, trust, and shared story is not simple. You cannot gossip your way through a dispute between 10,000 strangers. You cannot rely on a shared myth alone to settle who owns which section of a harvest when the people involved have never met and never will. Something had to replace what personal relationships used to carry. Something durable enough to function without everyone knowing everyone. That something wouldn't erase reputation, fear, or belief. It would do something more interesting. It would take everything informal power already knew how to do and give it a permanent address. Somewhere in the shift from wandering bands to settled farming communities, something had to give. Grain could be stored, which meant grain could be stolen. Land could be worked season after season, which meant land could be claimed, defended, and passed down. For the first time, humans were surrounded by surplus. And surplus is the one thing informal power was never built to manage. A reputation economy works when everyone can see everyone else's behavior. It collapses the moment strangers, storage, and inheritance enter the picture. Who gets the harvest when the person who planted it dies? Who arbitrates a dispute over a boundary neither party's grandparents remember drawing? Gossip can't answer these questions fast enough. Shared myth can't answer them precisely enough. What was needed wasn't a new kind of power. It was a way to make the old kind of power survive its own scale. This is where formalization begins, and it's worth being precise about what that word actually means here. It doesn't mean invention. It means encoding. The chief who once held authority because people personally trusted his judgment became a role, a title that could outlive the man holding it, passed to a son who hadn't yet earned that trust himself, but inherited the position anyway. The taboo that once lived only in memory and murmur became a law, carved or written, so it no longer depended on everyone remembering it correctly. The origin story once told around a fire became scripture, standardized, repeated the same way in every village, so belief could travel without distortion. None of these were new inventions. They were old instincts given permanence. A crown is reputation that no longer needs to be re-earned daily. A written law is a taboo that no longer relies on gossip to enforce it. A scripture is a myth that no longer depends on one storyteller's memory. Civilization didn't create hierarchy, justice, or belief. It built containers sturdy enough to hold instincts that used to require constant, exhausting maintenance by every person in the group, every single day. This is the real turning point of the story. Quieter than a war, less dramatic than a coronation, and far more consequential than either. It's the moment power stopped being something you had to personally perform and became something you could simply occupy. The throne hadn't arrived yet, but everything a throne would eventually need already existed. It just needed somewhere permanent to sit. Look closely at a crown, and it stops looking like an object of power and starts looking like something closer to a container, built to hold forces that already existed long before any goldsmith shaped it. Take reputation. In a small band, it had to be demonstrated constantly, through a hunt, a judgment, a moment of courage witnessed firsthand. A crown removed that requirement. Once you wore it, deference no longer needed to be earned fresh each day. It came pre-installed, attached to the object rather than the person wearing it. The crown did what reputation used to do, except now it didn't need daily proof. Take fear. In early groups, the person who could explain danger held sway only as long as their explanations kept working. A throne backed by an army, a treasury, a legal system, didn't need to keep proving its explanations correct. Fear became structural, built into the walls, the guards, the punishments written into law, rather than dependent on one person's ongoing credibility. Take shared story. Myth once required a storyteller, someone physically present to keep the belief alive from one generation to the next. Scripture, coronation rituals, national founding myths. These encoded belief into repeatable ceremony, so the story could survive without depending on any single voice remembering it correctly. This is worth naming plainly. A throne, a constitution, a corporate title, a national flag. None of these are the source of power. They are vessels. What they hold is exactly what this documentary has been tracing from the very first chapter. Reputation, fear, coalition, belief, just no longer dependent on being freshly earned, freshly proven, freshly told. That's the entire function of formal institutions. Not to create power, but to stabilize it, to let it outlive the individual currently holding it. There's an obvious advantage here. A container doesn't collapse the moment one person makes a mistake, loses a fight, or dies. It survives transitions that would have destroyed a purely informal system built on personal trust. But containers have a weakness that raw instinct never had. They can be mistaken for the thing itself. People start to believe the crown holds the power, rather than merely holding it in trust. And when that illusion runs deep enough, when a society forgets that the container was only ever meant to house something older and more fragile, that's usually when a container starts to crack. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over society when its institutions stop working. Not the loud collapse people usually imagine, burning buildings, dramatic overthrow, but something quieter and more revealing. Laws remain on the books, but stop being enforced consistently. Currency remains in circulation, but stops being trusted. Titles remain in use, but stop commanding automatic deference. The container is still standing. What was holding has started to leak out. And what leaks out first is always the same thing, regardless of century or geography. Not chaos. Exactly. Something more specific. People fall back on the oldest mechanisms available to them. The ones that predate any institution and never actually disappeared, only went quiet underneath the formal system while it was working. Reputation starts mattering more than official rank. Personal loyalty starts mattering more than legal contract. Local strongmen, warlords, trusted neighbors, extended family networks, the exact architecture from Chapter 1, dominance and coalition organized around fire, reassert itself because it never actually left. It was simply overshadowed by something more efficient, for as long as that something kept functioning. This is one of the more unsettling patterns available to a careful reading of history. Institutional collapse rarely produces true chaos in the sense of total randomness. It produces regression, a rapid slide back toward the oldest and most primal forms of organizing power, the ones humans have relied on the longest and trust the most instinctively, precisely because those forms don't require anyone to believe in an abstraction. They only require people to believe in each other, or fear each other, directly, which raises an uncomfortable possibility worth sitting with. Formal institutions may not be as solid as they appear. They may simply be a more efficient shell built over the same instincts that operated in a fire circle 50,000 years ago, a shell that holds beautifully as long as enough people believe in it, and reveals what was underneath the moment that belief starts to erode. This isn't a story confined to the ancient or medieval world. It's visible in modern collapses too. States that lose the trust of their citizens, corporations that lose the confidence of their employees, systems that keep their formal titles and structures intact while the substance quietly drains out of them. The shell often remains, standing long after what it was built to hold is already gone. Which brings the story to the present moment. Because if this architecture never actually left, if it's simply been hiding underneath more sophisticated containers, it should still be visible today, if you know where to look. It is. It's everywhere. Walk into almost any modern organization, and the fire circle is still there. It just doesn't look like one anymore. Consider a company with an official org chart, titles, departments, a clear chain of command printed neatly and distributed to every employee. And then consider what actually happens inside a meeting. Certain people get interrupted less. Certain opinions get treated as settled the moment they're spoken, regardless of title. Certain individuals hold influence that has nothing to do with their position on the chart, and everything to do with reputation quietly earned over years of being right, being reliable, being someone whose judgment the group has learned to trust. The formal structure exists. It runs alongside an informal one that, in practice, often matters more. Or consider reputation itself, which never actually went anywhere. It simply migrated on a new infrastructure. A rating, a review, a follower count, a verified badge. These function almost exactly like the whispered reputation economy of a small band. Constantly recalculated, publicly visible, capable of opening or closing access to opportunity based on nothing but what other people currently think of you. The mechanism is thousands of years old. Only the interface changed. Or consider gossip, still operating as government, just distributed at a scale no small band could have imagined. Public accountability, online criticism, viral scrutiny. These function as enforcement without institution. Exactly like the earliest social policing this documentary opened with, except the group being policed is no longer 40 people around a fire. It's potentially millions. Or consider fear and interpretation, still doing exactly what they did in Chapter 6. Except now the person explaining the danger might be a news anchor, an analyst, an algorithm surfacing what should alarm you next. The role is identical. Whoever can convincingly name the threat still gains disproportionate influence over how a group responds to it. None of this means modern institutions are fake, or that formal titles don't matter. They matter enormously. That's precisely what containers are for. But underneath every formal structure, the same primal currencies are still being traded, exactly as they were traded around the first fire. Reputation, fear, coalition, story. Recognizing this doesn't diminish modern institutions. It explains why they behave the way they do, especially under pressure, especially when trust erodes, especially in the moments Chapter 11 described, when the formal shell starts to crack and something much older shows through underneath. The fire never went out. It just moved indoors. Pull back far enough, and everything traced across this documentary starts to look less like a sequence of separate discoveries and more like a single structure viewed from different distances. Reputation was the first currency, born the moment humans began keeping track of each other's behavior. Gossip was the first legal system, enforcing norms without courts or written codes. Fear was the first source of interpretive authority, granting influence to whoever could explain what threatened the group. Shared story was the first infrastructure capable of scaling cooperation beyond the size any single memory could hold. Informal institutions, thrones, laws, scripture, org charts, currencies, were never a break from any of this. They were containers built to stabilize instincts that used to require constant, exhausting maintenance by every person in a group every single day. None of these mechanisms replaced the one before it. They layered. A modern institution doesn't eliminate reputation, fear, coalition, and story. It sits on top of them, channels them, gives them a more durable shape. That's why collapse doesn't produce true chaos. It produces regression to whichever layer is still functioning underneath. The primal architecture isn't a relic sitting at the bottom of human history, gathering dust. It's the load-bearing structure the entire building still stands on, whether or not anyone inside remembers it's there. This is the part worth sitting with in silence for a moment, rather than rushing past. We tend to imagine progress as a series of replacements. One system discarded, a better one built in its place. Kingdoms replaced by republics. Superstition replaced by science. Tribes replaced by nations. But power didn't follow that pattern. It followed a pattern closer to renovation. The same rooms, built over and over, each time with sturdier materials, each time under a different name, each time convincing the people living inside it that this version, finally, was something new. It rarely was. What changed was scale, permanence, and the sophistication of the container. What stayed constant across 50,000 years, and every civilization the species has built, is the architecture doing the actual work inside that container. Who gets believed, who gets deferred to, who gets feared, and who gets to tell the story that explains why. That architecture doesn't belong to any single era. It doesn't belong to kings or corporations or algorithms. It belongs to the species that build all three, using the same blueprint every time, whether or not it ever noticed it was doing so. There's a version of this story that would end here on a satisfying note. Civilization solved the problem of raw power, tamed it, gave it rules and containers sturdy enough to protect people from its rawest, most primal form. It's a comforting way to close. It's also not quite honest. Civilization didn't solve power. It made it slower to break and harder to see. That's a real achievement. A throne that can't be seized by the strongest arm in the room. A law that applies the same to a stranger as to a neighbor. A currency that doesn't require anyone to personally trust you before extending value. These are genuine improvements over a system that ran entirely on daily proof and constant vigilance. But improvement is not resolution. The instincts sitting underneath every formal system, the deference, the fear, the coalition building, the hunger for a story that explains the danger, never went anywhere. They were only ever managed, never removed. This is easy to miss on a first pass through this history, because the story moves forward, from fire circles to kingdoms to modern institutions. And forward motion feels like progress resolving something. But watch it again, and a different pattern emerges. Every layer added wasn't a solution to the layer before it. It was a more sophisticated way of hosting the same unresolved instincts, buying stability without ever actually answering the original question, standing at the center of all of it. Why do humans organize around certain people at all? Why does deference form so easily, so early, so universally, in groups as small as 40 and as large as nations? No king answered that question. No constitution answered it. No algorithm ranking today's most trusted voices has answered it either. Every structure this documentary has traced was built to manage that instinct more efficiently. None of them were built to explain where it came from, or whether it can ever be fully outgrown. Maybe it can't be. Maybe the honest answer isn't that civilization tamed something wild, but that it built increasingly elegant rooms for something that was never going to leave the building. That's not a comfortable place to end a documentary. It's a more honest one. There's a temptation, at the end of a story like this, to reach for a lesson, to say power is something to be feared, or resisted, or reformed once and for all. That temptation should be resisted, because it flattens something far more interesting into something merely cautionary. What this documentary actually reveals is quieter than a warning. Power did not arrive with kings, or writing, or law. It arrived with humans. The moment more than one of them stood near the same fire and had to decide, without discussion, who spoke first. Everything built since then, every throne and constitution and corporation and platform, has been an attempt to give that original arrangement a shape sturdy enough to survive its own success. Not to eliminate it, to house it. This is why institutions rise and fall in patterns that echo each other across centuries and continents that never touched. It's why collapse so rarely produces true chaos, and instead reveals the same primal order waiting patiently underneath the formal one. It's why modern organizations, for all their org charts and mission statements, still run on reputation, fear, coalition, and story. The same four currencies traded around the first fire, simply denominated differently now. History rarely repeats itself in the same form. What repeats are the structures that reward certain behaviors, preserve certain instincts, and quietly shape the choices people believe they are making freely. The names change. The architecture rarely does. Power rarely announces itself. It leaves patterns. If understanding those patterns changes the way you see the world, you'll find more of them here.